Okay, so we are now having chapter 2 of Harun and the Sea of Stories, and the chapter is the Shah of Blah. You probably know that a Shah is a leader in an Arab country. Um, so this seems to be taking place in an Arab country because everybody has an Arab name, like Rashid Khalifa. Khalifa, I guess it is. Anyway, the last part I read you was where um, the last part I read you was about the super poor who had no homes. They slept on pavements and in the doorways of shops. They had to pay rent to local gangsters, and just for doing that. And the truth is that Harun was lucky. But what he says is, you've got a lucky star watching over you, and then all of a sudden, it's bunk, which means nothing. So in the sad city, people mostly had big families, but the poor children got sick and starved, while the rich kids overate and quarreled over their parents' money. Still, Harun wanted to know why his parents hadn't had more children. But the only answer he ever got from his father, Rashid, was no answer at all. There's more to you, young Harun Khalifa, than meets the blinking eye. Well, what was that supposed to mean? We used up all our full quota of child stuff just in making you, Rashid explained. It's all packed in there. Enough for maybe 4 or 5 kids. Yes, sir, more to you than the blinking eye can see. Straight answers were beyond the powers of Rashid Khalifa, who would never take a shortcut if there was a longer, twistier road available. Soraya, his mother, gave Harun a simpler reply. We tried, she sadly said. This child business is not such an easy thing. Think of the poor Senguptas. The Senguptas lived upstairs. Mr. Sengupta was a clerk in the offices of the city corporation, and he was a sticky thin and whiny voice, and Mingy as his wife. I don't know what Mingy means. Onita was generous and loud and wobbly fat. They had no children at all, and as a result, Onita Sengupta paid more attention to Harun than he really cared for. She brought him sweetmeats, that's candy, I think, which was fine, and ruffled his hair. I don't have any hair to ruffle, which wasn't okay. And when she hugged him, the great cascades is like a waterfall, of her flesh seemed to surround him completely, to his considerable alarm. Mr. Sengupta ignored Harun, but he was always talking to Soraya, which Harun didn't like, particularly as the fellow would launch into criticisms of his father Rashid, the storyteller, whenever he thought Harun wasn't listening. That husband of yours, excuse me if I mention, he would start in his thin, whiny voice. He's got his head stuck in the air and his feet off the ground. What are all these stories? Life is not a storybook or a joke shop. All this fun will come to no good. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? Harun, listening hard outside the window, decided he did not care for Mr. Sengupta, this man who hated stories and storytellers. He didn't care for him one little bit. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? Harun couldn't get this terrible question out of his head. However, there were people who thought Rashid's stories were useful. In those days, it was almost election time, and the grand panjandrums of various political parties all came to Rashid, smiling their fat cat smiles, and to beg him to tell his stories at their rallies and nobody else's. It was well known that if you could get Rashid's magic tongue on your side, then your troubles were over. Nobody ever believed anything a Politico said, even though they pretended as hard as they could that they were telling the truth. In fact, this was how everyone knew they were lying. But everyone had complete faith in Rashid because he always admitted that everything he told them was completely untrue and made up out of his own head. So the politicos, those are people in politics who want to become president or senator or something. So the politicos needed Rashid to help them win the people's votes. They lined up outside his door with their shiny faces and fake smiles and bags of hard cash money. Rashid could pick and choose. On the day that everything went wrong, Harun was on his way home from school when he was caught in the first downpour of the rainy season. Now, when the rains came to this sad city, life became a little easier to bear. There were delicious pomfret in the sea at that time of year. I don't know what pomfret are. It's a kind of a fish, Grandma says. So people could have a break from the glumfish, and the air was cool and clean because the rain washed away most of the black smoke billowing out of the sadness factories where they manufacture sadness. Harun Khalifa loved the feeling of getting soaked to the skin in the first rain of the year. So he skipped about and got a wonderful warm drenching and opened his mouth to let the raindrops plop on his tongue. He arrived home looking as wet and shiny as a pomfret in the sea. Miss Onita, Sengupta, was standing on her upstairs balcony, shaking like a jelly, as if it hadn't been raining. Harun might have noticed that she was crying. He went indoors and found Rashid the storyteller looking as if he'd stuck his face out of the window because his eyes and cheeks were soaking wet, even though his clothes were dry. Harun's mother, Soraya, had run off with Mr. Sengupta. She went away with another man? At 11 a.m., precisely, she had sent Rashid into Harun's room, telling him to search for some missing socks. A few seconds later, while he was busy with the hunt, Harun was very good at losing his socks. Rashid heard the front door slam, and an instant later, the sound of a car in the lane. He returned to the living room to find his wife gone, and a taxi speeding away around the corner. She must have planned it very carefully, he thought. The clock still stood at 11 o'clock exactly. Rashid picked up a hammer and smashed the clock to bits. Then he broke every other clock in the house, including the one on Harun's bedside table. The first thing Harun said on hearing the news of his mother's departure and leaving was, "Why did you have to break my clock for?" Soraya had left a note full of all the nasty things Mr. Sengupta used to say about Rashid. "You are only interested in pleasure, but a proper man would know that life is a serious business. Your brain is full of make-believe, so there's no room in it for facts. Mr. Sengupta has no imagination at all. This is okay by me." There was a postscript, a little note at the end. "Tell Harun I love him, but I can't help it. I have to do this now." Rainwater dripped onto the note from Harun's hair. "What to do, son?" Rashid pleaded pitifully. "Storytelling is the only work I know." When he heard his father sounding so pathetic, Harun lost his temper and shouted, "What's the point of it? What's the use of stories that aren't even true?" Rashid hid his face in his hand and wept. Harun wanted to get those words back, to pull them out of his father's ears and shove them back into his own mouth. But of course he couldn't do that. and that was why he blamed himself when, soon afterwards, and in the most embarrassing circumstances imaginable, an unthinkable thing happened. Rashid Khalifa, the legendary Ocean of Notions, the fabled Shah of Blah, stood up in front of a huge audience, opened his mouth, and found that he had run out of stories to tell. After his mother left home, Harun found that he couldn't keep his mind on anything for very long, or, to be precise, for more than 11 minutes at a time. Rashid took him to a movie to cheer him up, but exactly after 11 minutes, Harun's attention wandered. Oh, no. And when the film ended, he had no idea how it all turned out and had to ask Rashid if the good guys won in the end. The next day, Harun was playing goalie in a neighborhood game of street hockey. Hockey is sort of like soccer, except you knock a little hard, round, forget what it's called, puck, with a stick. Maybe you know what it is. And after pulling off a string of brilliant saves in the first 11 minutes, he began to let in the softest, most foolish, most humiliating of goals. It is just like soccer. There's a goal, and there's a goalie that defends the goal, but he tries to stop things with his gloves or with his stick. And so it went on. His mind was always wandering off somewhere and leaving his body behind. This created certain difficulties because many interesting and some important things take longer than 11 minutes. Meals, for example, and mathematics, examinations, tests. It was Onita Sengupta who put her finger on the trouble. She had started coming downstairs even more often than before. For instance, to announce defiantly, "No more Mrs. Sengupta for me. From now on, call me Miss Onita only." After which she smacked her forehead violently and wailed, "Oh, oh, oh, what is to become?" When Rashid told Miss Onita about Harun's wandering attention, however, she spoke firmly and with certainty. 11 o'clock is when his mother left, she declared. Now comes this problem of 11 minutes. Cause is located in his pussycology. It took Rashid and Harun a few moments to work out that she meant psychology. Pussycology is psychology. Well, it's a little bit close, I guess. Owing to pussycological sadness, Miss Onita continued, the young master is stuck fast on his 11 number and cannot get to 12. That's not true, Harun protested, but in his heart he feared it might be. Was he stuck in time like a broken clock? Maybe the problem would never be solved unless and until Soraya returned to start the clocks up once again. Some days later, Rashid Khalifa was invited to perform by politicos from the town of G and the nearby valley of K, which nestled in the mountains of M. I should explain that the country of Aleph Bay, doesn't that sound like Aleph Bet? That's interesting. Many places were named after letters of the alphabet. This led to much confusion because there were only a limited number of letters and an almost unlimited number of places in need of names. As a result, many places were obliged to share a single name. This meant that people's letters were always going to the wrong address. If I wrote a letter and I said it was from M Avenue or Rehov M, could be any number of other places out of Rehov M. or mem, I guess, in Hebrew. Okay, this meant that people's letters were always going to the wrong address. Such difficulties were made even worse by the way, in certain places, such as this sad city, forgot their names entirely. The people forgot their names and their addresses, everything. The employees of the National Mail Service had a lot to put up with, you can imagine. So they got a little excitable at times and yelled at the people. "What's wrong with you, you idiot?" "We should go," Rashid said to Harun, putting a brave face on things. In the town of G and the valley of K, the weather is still fine, whereas here the air is too weepy for words. I can't even find words. It was true that it was raining so hard in the sad city that you could almost drown just by breathing in. Miss Onita, who just happened to have dropped in from upstairs, agreed sadly with Rashid. "Tip-top plan," she said. "Yes, both of you go. It will be like a little holiday. No need to worry about me sitting all by myself." "The town of G is not so special," Rashid told Harun as the train carried them toward that very place. "But the valley of K, now that is different. There are fields of gold and mountains of silver, and in the middle of the valley there is a beautiful lake, whose name, by the way, is dull." Now, dull means boring. That's a strange name for a lake. If it's so beautiful, why isn't it called interesting? Harun argued. And Rashid, making a huge effort to be in a good mood, tried to put on his old witchy fingers act. "Ah, yes, the interesting lake," he said in his most mysterious voice. "Now that's something else again. That's a lake of many names. Yes, sir, so it is." Rashid went on trying to sound happy. He told Harun about the luxury class houseboat waiting for them on the dull lake. He talked about the ruined fairy castle on the dull lake. He talked about the pleasure gardens built by the ancient emperors, which came right down to the edge of the dull lake. Gardens with fountains and terraces and pavilions of pleasure, where the spirits of the ancient kings still flew about in the guise of hopo birds. I think that's made up. But after exactly 11 minutes, Harun stopped listening, and Rashid stopped talking too, and they stared silently out of the window of the railway carriage at the unfolding boredom of the plains. That's all for this chapter. I hope you are enjoying this. I am enjoying it myself, and I look forward to hearing about whether you liked it.